Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my in-depth analysis of Tales of Zestiria. If you haven't seen part 1 already, please do so, as it acts as an introduction to this series of videos and goes over the game's world and level design. The video you're currently watching will go over the game's combat extensively, and will also call back to the combat systems of previous entries. This may make some parts of the video difficult to grasp without prior knowledge, but it's definitely not a prerequisite. Just something to keep in mind if you're unfamiliar with the series. I'm pretty sure there's enough context given in this video with the footage that you should be able to follow along with what I'm saying. Now with that out of the way, let's get down to business. An indisputable foundation of the Tales series is the action RPG combat, known as the Linear Motion Battle System, or LMBS for short. There have been numerous permutations of LMBS over the years, each with their own unique names to distinguish them. The one used in Tales of Zestiria is known as the Fusonic Chain Linear Motion Battle System. But before diving into how it works, we're going to need to rewind and examine the Style Shift Linear Motion Battle System that is showcased in the 12th entry of the series, Tales of Grace's F. While in some ways, the gameplay of this specific entry remains consistent with what fans have come to expect from the series, even a quick glance is enough to discern that the entire dynamic of combat has been changed drastically when compared to all that have come before it. For one, Grace's F places a much greater emphasis on blocking and dodging, mechanics that have been serviceable but not especially integral in prior entries. Not only that, but gone are normal attacks that would chain into base arts and arcane arts. They're instead replaced with assault arts and burst arts respectively. The cherry on top was removing technical points, the franchise equivalent to a magic meter, in favor of the chain capacity system, which much more closely resembles a form of stamina management. Now, you might be asking, what the heck does Tales of Grace's F have to do with Tales of Zestiria? Well, to put it bluntly, the Fusonic Chain Linear Motion Battle System used for Tales of Zestiria is almost a carbon copy of the Style Shift variation implemented in Tales of Grace's F. But, and that's a big but, with some very notable alterations. It should be noted that during the lead up to Tales of Zestiria's release, fans responded very positively to the reveal that the combat would bear so much resemblance to the aforementioned 12th entry. While it has its detractors, it's easily one of the most highly praised in the series, to the point where many to this day consider it to be the very best. With that in mind, this was looking to be a slam dunk, another meaty and technical collection of systems for fans to really dig their teeth into and create combo videos for years to come. But that didn't really happen. And it's difficult to ignore that the expectations being set didn't influence that air of disappointment to a pretty noticeable degree. Beyond that, however, when examining the current state of how the game plays, it's almost as if the decision to move forward with this style of combat was considered separately from the rest of the ideas and features being implemented in the game. This brings up a very important question. If the combat systems between these two games are so similar, why doesn't it work in Tales of Zestiria? Well, to fully comprehend why the combat suffers so much, it's vitally important to realize that this game incorporated a brand new feature that was not present in any of the previous entries in the form of seamless battle transitions. Most games in the series up to this point made use of something that, for the sake of convenience, I'm going to be dubbing them battle arenas. To quickly explain what I'm talking about, when the player came in contact with an enemy, a fight would break out. However, instead of it taking place in the immediate vicinity, the player is instead transported to a close facsimile of that location in order for the confrontation to take place there instead. In doing this, the developers had the freedom to create environments that were not restricted by the necessity of them also being viable for the game's combat system. It was actually an elegant solution to what would have otherwise been a substantial problem. A problem that now exists in Tales of Zestiria. The developers decided that now when you engage enemies, it's in the exact same area that the player finds them in. It should be noted that this is not an inherently poor idea, as the Kingdom Hearts series does essentially the same thing and has been very successful at it. However, the difference is that Kingdom Hearts has both level design and controls catered around this concept. Tales of Zestiria, on the other hand, attempts to implement this idea without altering the combat, controls, or camera in a way that suits the change. This is clearly a misguided attempt to spice up the formula, and while admirable in its intent, the sad fact is that not enough was done to make this work, and as a result, there are a lot of reasons why it doesn't. For starters, there used to be a tangible sense of freedom in combat that allowed the player to experiment how they saw fit. This is due to the fact that there was very little in the player's way, except for the enemies themselves, and the boundary of the battle arena itself, which was usually quite large and generally unobtrusive. Alternatively, in Tales of Zestiria, the player now has to contend with environmental obstructions that just so happen to be in the vicinity when one initiates a battle, such as bushes, trees, rocks, and an assortment of other random annoyances that either obfuscates the player's view, or even more egregious, causes the camera to become physically caught up in the object itself. This is further compounded by a circular boundary that appears in nearly every encounter in the game that encases the player's party along with the enemies. The use of the boundary is made all the worse when the player starts a battle in a hallway or the corner of a room, as this causes the camera to get caught up in the level geometry itself. While the existence of the boundary is justified in older titles, it's debatable how necessary it is in Tales of Zestiria, given the lack of battle arenas. The game in its current state serves to make battles feel claustrophobic, something that is exacerbated by the many indoor environments that do not work well with the rigid camera system. A good deal of these problems could have been avoided, or at least turned out less egregious, had the developers made substantial changes to the characters' movesets. But they didn't. What they did instead was pretty much one-to-one the exact same character movement from Tales of Graces F, except the game's performance is noticeably worse. You know, it's interesting observing all of these flaws and then taking a look at Tales of Berseria, which was released 2 years after good old Zesty. While I'm not in love with the combat itself, Berseria did many things to fix and by extension, vastly improve upon the blemishes that plagued its predecessor. For starters, there's full camera control. Oh, thank you. This is an absolute godsend that immediately eliminates the issue of the camera constantly trying to orient itself behind your character. The size of the boundary has also been noticeably increased, which is itself a nice improvement. But what really makes this work is how the level design actually accommodates the combat system this time around. Instead of cramped indoor locations that make battles a chore, the majority of areas where battles take place are wide and open, allowing for enough freedom of movement and not a ton of camera fiddling either. As they say, hindsight is 20/20, and it's tough to say why the developers weren't able to implement these fixes the first time around with Zesty. Maybe there was debate as to whether enemies would be fought on location, and the change was implemented late. Or this could have been due to a lack of communication between the developers. Whatever the reason may be, it's good that the team acknowledged these problems and sought to fix them, even if it took a whole other game to do it. Now, I've mentioned Tales of Graces F a few times already, and the reason is because its combat was snappy, quick, and cathartic. Unlike Tales of Zestiria, which feels as if the characters are wading through an invisible tar that drags all their movements down. While the frame rate may or may not be the sole culprit for the game's lethargic sense of speed, the fact that Graces F ran at 60 frames per second and Zestiria runs at 30 certainly doesn't help things. What's worse is that the game is locked at 30 on all platforms, including PC. Now, this is merely speculation, so only take it as such. However, it's possible that when the initial PS3 version was made, the developers decided to tie the game's logic to the frame rate. What this means is that if it were raised to 60, the entire game would run way too fast and could possibly break it in unforeseen ways, which would explain the locked 30 on all platforms. Frame rates aside, it's difficult to discern how much of an impact that had on the general sense of sluggishness, especially given that some games run at 30 and don't feel nearly as slow. But the fact of the matter is that the game's performance desperately leaves something to be desired. Despite all of those transgressions, what truly hurts the character movement, much more than the lowered speed, is how it was tailored around the camera. In previous entries, there was no camera control during combat, which was fine. It worked well because there was rarely a need for it. How your player character oriented their movements in Tales of Grace's F was dependent on whichever enemy the player was locked onto, and the player's viewpoint would adjust itself automatically. Considering Tales of Grace's F used battle arenas just like all the previous games in the series before it, this was never an issue, as the camera would typically move exactly where it needed to be for the sake of the player, which wasn't hard because all it really needed to do was make sure the player could see themselves and the enemy. Tales of Zestiria unwittingly replicates this without the obvious benefits of that isolated space. As mentioned prior, when discussing the drawbacks of the boundary system during combat, this causes the camera to get caught up in the level geometry, which is a far more severe issue when a fight breaks out indoors. Instead of giving the player control of the camera during combat to at least try and alleviate the issue, the player is instead at the mercy of wherever that camera happens to be. That being said, in the interest of fairness, there actually is an option to adjust the camera in the menu during a battle. However, it does little to nothing in regards to alleviating the core issue. All of this comes together to create a complete mess that truly only works in wide open spaces, and all of this saying nothing of the combat itself. So, not counting mystic arts, Tales of Zestiria has three main types of arts: martial, hidden, and seraphic. Martial and hidden are physical attacks that are sometimes mixed with magical and elemental properties, while seraphic arts are this game's equivalent to spells, which are exclusive to your Seraph party members. Martial arts are assigned to the X button, and are divided up into 4 predetermined trees, respective to the direction the analog stick is facing. In other words, you would get a completely separate string of attacks if you were to mash the X button while holding the analog stick to the left, compared to if you were holding it to the right. Hidden arts alternatively are tied to the circle button and are a bit more customizable, allowing the player to assign the hidden art of their choosing to whatever button commands they so desire. However, there's a bit more to it than that. It turns out that all the hidden arts connect to each other from lower tiers to higher tiers. What this means is if the player has the Sonic Thrust and Crimson Edge hidden arts already learned, then instead of assigning them to different button commands, it's possible to assign Sonic Thrust by itself, and then during battle, keeping the circle button held down will automatically change Sonic Thrust into Crimson Edge. Eventually, Crimson Edge will also change into Raging Winds, which is the strongest hidden art in that specific chain of arts, resulting in all 3 attacks being initiated in succession. There are 12 hidden arts in total for the main character Saray, and since there are 4 button commands that can be assigned, this means that you can have all 12 hidden arts available to you at once. While this all sounds nice on paper, there are a few problems, including the design decision behind holding down the circle button to perform this action. Oh god, Daniel, really? You're gonna complain about having to hold down the button? Okay, listen, I know how nitpicky and pedantic as hell that sounds, but there's more to it, trust me. The first issue here is that it lacks the visceral nature of mashing the button. When you press a button repeatedly, in order to initiate a series of attacks, it carries with it a more innate sense of catharsis compared to holding the button down for the exact same function. This is primarily because pressing the button repeatedly is a far more active motion for the player as opposed to holding it down. This also correlates much better with what the player themselves is doing physically when compared to the actions of the character on screen. This is why holding down a button is perfect for blocking and charge attacks. In a weird way, it simulates the same type of action, which in turn creates a stronger connection between the player and the character they're playing as. When this sense of connectivity is lost, however, this typically leads to the player feeling as if they are lacking a sense of agency. Just think for a moment how awkward it would be if the game demanded to repeatedly mash the block button in order for it to work. Something about that just wouldn't feel right, and it's because the actions of the player are not in sync with the character. With that in mind, as the player, when you hold the button down and you see Serraid wailing on the enemy by himself, on top of that disconnect, it also feels as if the game is running on autopilot. To clarify, this isn't inherently a bad thing, as there are plenty of games that benefit from this playstyle, but this is rarely a good thing for an action-based combat system which is supposed to emphasize quick reflexes and player skill. That being said, what about Mystic Arts? Why is it that watching a short cutscene during battle is okay, but not holding the circle button for hidden arts? The main difference is that hidden arts are still occurring during active gameplay, which contributes to that off feeling discussed earlier, as opposed to Mystic Arts, which are contextualized differently in combat. The way Mystic Arts are performed is by fulfilling certain requirements and being rewarded with not only the damage, but the spectacle of the attack itself. Not only that, but given that Mystic Arts are very clearly defined as predetermined cutscenes and not active gameplay, there's no sense of agency lost, because the challenge comes from fulfilling the conditions and making the player still feel in control when the Mystic Art is activated, as it represents the player's accomplishment. Sadly, none of which applies to how hidden arts are implemented, making them feel distinctly unsatisfying to use. Another problem that arises from this decision is the inability to switch between different combo chains. This isn't a problem for the martial arts, in that if you are holding forward for the first half of the combo, and then decide to hold to the right instead, the combo would transition into the separate chain of attacks. In fact, you could even transition from a martial art into a hidden art, but not the other way around. Hidden arts do not function the same way. Once the button is held down, the player is pretty much stuck with that specific chain of attacks until the animation is over. This makes it so that the player can't interchange attacks between the two different types of arts in a way that flows naturally, which stunts any sort of combo creativity for the player. Now, in the interest of fairness, a similar separation did exist in Tales of Grace's F, but it could be argued its implementation was far more thoughtful. In that game, assault arts are very fast and allow for multi-hit combos, while burst arts are slower and generally more difficult to string together multiple attacks, but the individual hits are far stronger and sometimes have special properties. The biggest twist here, however, is that the player by default can use assault arts right away when the battle starts. However, a maneuver has to be executed first before being able to use burst arts, and then again to switch back to assault arts. This is different for each character, and in the main character's case, it involves him physically unsheathing his sword to initiate burst arts, and then sheathing it again in order to revert it back to assault arts. While there are ways to get around the sword sheathing maneuver in order to switch back and forth more seamlessly from the two different types of arts, doing so requires a higher level of mastery over the game's combat system. With that in mind, the average player would have to make use of that mechanic first in order to access the other type of attack. This in turn gave battles a certain degree of strategy, as it encouraged the player to make a serious consideration during battle as to which of the two types of attacks were the most appropriate for any given situation. No such considerations or strategy in this vein are in Tales of Zestiria. Neither does the game offer the same push for mastery of the game's combat mechanics. The biggest differences between the two types of arts is that on a surface level, the martial arts are weak but fast, while hidden arts are slow but strong. Or at least that is the presumed intention. The fact of the matter is that not only is the game unclear about this, but the attacks themselves come across as interchangeable, making the distinction between them come across as completely arbitrary. There's nothing mechanically interesting done to separate the two types of arts, which inevitably makes the entire system come across as redundant and unfocused. This clearly wouldn't have been an issue had the game more closely copied what Tales of Graces F did. That said, when Tales of Zestiria wasn't poorly emulating its older brother, it managed to create an admittedly unique and potentially interesting, but ultimately very conflicted and confused system, known in-universe as Armatization. During the first handful of hours into the game, Saray and subsequently the player are granted this ability, which in turn allows Saray to fuse with his Seraph party members. The idea is that the player grows more powerful when making use of this mechanic. However, the drawback is that there's one less party member. Throughout the game, the player's party will accrue and consist of 4 Seraphs, each representing their own respective elements: fire, wind, water, and earth. Depending on the element, your character's moveset will be completely different, which goes quite a long way in making each of them feel distinct. The Fire Armatus allows you to wield a giant inflamed broadsword. The Water Armatus a bow that shoots high-pressure water blasts. The Earth Armatus, giant floating fists that raise parts of the ground, and the Wind Armatus, blade-like wings to summon whirlwinds. What makes these even better is that they're unlocked through plot progression, which effectively builds a sense of anticipation for when the player receives them. There's something undeniably exciting about getting meaningful upgrades that expand the combat in a tangible way, particularly if the player is anxiously waiting for the next one. It's such a shame, however, that despite it coming across as a net positive for the game, the execution leaves something to be desired. To make use of Armatization, one must build up at least 3 points in the blast gauge, immediately lampshading the biggest problem as this gauge recovers very quickly. Not only does the gauge recover by blocking, dodging, and with certain skills through attacking, it also naturally fills up on its own during combat. This might come across as pedantic, but by making the transformation so readily accessible to the player, it takes away its sense of purpose, especially given its narrative significance. Armatization, as it's framed in the story, is a secret art, reserved for the shepherd, but it's hard to appreciate it as such when the game allows the player to exploit it so regularly in battle. With that in mind, while Saray is definitely more powerful when transformed, it's not the quantum leap it should feel, given that he's suddenly wielding grandiose weaponry imbued with the power of the elements. There's an unfortunate disparity at play here that could have easily been rectified had Armatization been balanced differently. If the burst gauge was more difficult to build up and the forms themselves were more powerful to compensate, this could have gone a long way in making each transformation feel like an event, the moment where the player gets to turn the tide of battle. Instead, it comes across as merely a half step above playing the game in the normal human form. Now, despite the fact that the game is clearly balanced around the player abusing Armatization, there are tutorials that insist on framing the mechanic as a useful addition to your arsenal, but not the dominant strategy, which is not only completely untrue, but is arguably the greatest flaw of Armatization. While the issue isn't noticeable when the ability is first made available, it becomes more and more evident that situations when not transformed mean the player is almost always at a distinct disadvantage. This severely devalues about half of the combat mechanics, on the grounds that the moves you learn for the human form feel more and more worthless as the game goes on. This is compounded even further by the elemental weakness system. No doubt most watching are intimately familiar with the exceedingly common RPG mechanic of exploiting an enemy's elemental weakness in order to get a leg up in battle. As mentioned earlier, Armatization not only allows for Saray to transform, but also command one of the 4 elements. With this in mind, the issue of the dominant strategy is exacerbated, because battles eventually devolve into the mind-numbing chore of picking the appropriate element in order to win. This significantly cuts down on the player's freedom of expression due to the difference in damage between an enemy weak against the element, one neutral to it, and much worse, one strong against it. Attacking an enemy with the element it is strong against will result in damage values as low as single digits worth per strike. The issue is less about enemies that are resistant to certain elements, because even if the damage values are unnecessarily extreme, it does make sense to want to incentivize intelligent play by punishing the player for playing mindlessly. The problem more so lies with the huge gap of damage between neutral and weakness-based attacks. Elemental damage carrying so much influence in battle, in conjunction with Armatization being a key combat mechanic centered around utilizing the elements, means that combat boils down to transforming into whatever element the enemy is weak against and mindlessly wailing on it. Once all 4 elements are unlocked, nearly every encounter boils down to this, which removes any real sense of tactics and simply railroads the player into the most obvious, dominant strategy. What would be the point of using the element of wind against an enemy weak to fire? Assuming the enemy isn't resistant to wind, the player is still needlessly depriving themselves of a substantial amount of extra damage, which would result in fights that will feel long and drawn out otherwise. This is compounded by the glacial sense of speed during combat due to characters feeling like they're wading through muck just to move. Having enemies weak and resistant to certain types of attacks is not an inherently bad idea. Proper use of this system could have helped vary up the combat and teach players how to use different types of attacks as opposed to simply relying on the same ones. The problem with Zestiria's execution of this idea is that it takes it entirely too far. Instead of lightly pushing the player into trying new things, it borderline forces them to do it, which unfortunately makes the combat increasingly stagnant as the game progresses. It's difficult to look back on everything discussed and not come to the conclusion that the combat is a poorly thought out and rushed mess. That isn't to say that enjoyment cannot be derived from the combat, as it still retains many of the familiar elements that made the combat system in Tales of Grace's F such a joy to play. It's a shame then that knowing what came before Tales of Zestiria's combat can't help but come across as a shadow of something greater.